Hi, Elise /Akilla here, and today is just a kind of a rough draft for a presentation that I'll be doing for a club at school. So here goes. Everyone makes mistakes, no matter how much we try to avoid it. Most mistakes don't result in a life or death consequence, but some do. And when one person's mistake is combined with a government being slow to enact preventative measures, and a company not taking proactive measures to ensure safety of its products, a tragedy like the mass poisoning of elixir sulfanilamide is the result. Around January 1937, a handful of years before penicillin use, and shortly after an article released suggesting sulfanilamide as a treatment for strep throat infections, there was a need identified for a liquid form of sulfanilamide to make it more palatable for children, which had then only been available in tablet and powder form. A pharmaceutical company, S.E. Massengill, decided to solve this problem, and the chief chemist, Harold Watkins, was assigned the task. The resulting medication was elixir sulfanilamide, a raspberry-flavored liquid medicine, including ingredients like raspberry extract, saccharin, amaranth, and caramel for appearance and taste, along with sulfanilamide for the medical benefit, and diethylene glycol, which allowed the medicine to be in liquid form. Now, diethylene glycol is a great solvent for water-insoluble chemicals and is used in many things, but it was already a known toxic substance, being used in antifreeze, for example, and Harold Watkins was apparently ignorant to that fact and the current research and literature in several medical journals that were about diethylene glycol and its side effects of kidney failure and death. It is also a cheap ingredient compared to the safer and more expensive medication diluents. Whether Harold Watkins chose to use diethylene glycol because it was cheap or because he was unaware of the toxicity is unknown. That knowledge presumably slipped through his fingers, which is bad enough, but due to the lack of regulations surrounding new medications at the time, there were no other checks and balances before it was sold. No other eyes on it to catch this fatal flaw in oversight. The company did not test its medications for safety before selling them, assumed their chemist had made no mistakes, and shipped out the elixir to pharmacies across the country to 15 different states. Additionally, diethylene glycol was not listed as an ingredient on the product, so nobody seeing it on the shelf would have any clue that it was a dangerous product, even if they were knowledgeable about ingredients to already know about diethylene glycol. Notably, this was the first, but not the last, mass poisoning due to diethylene glycol. From 1969 to 2025, there have been multiple incidents around the world of deaths from products containing this poison, with the most recent being multiple deaths of children from cough syrups using diethylene glycol as an ingredient in India. But back to this first mass poisoning. Elixir sulfanilamide was shipped out to pharmacies in 15 different states in September of 1937, with most of the medication going to Oklahoma and Mississippi. Everything seemed to be going well until the American Medical Association started receiving reports in October from Oklahoma after local doctors in Tulsa started making connections between consumption of elixir sulfanilamide and multiple deaths due to kidney failure. This led to the FDA being alerted through an anonymous tip, and that in turn led to the University of Chicago receiving a contract from the FDA to conduct a study on elixir sulfanilamide to find out why it was killing people. Again, because it wasn't listed on the ingredients list, nobody had any idea why people were dying from it. Frances Kelsey was the first woman to earn a PhD in pharmacology, and it was while she was a graduate student working on that PhD that she was tasked with this project from the FDA. She was the one who determined that diethylene glycol was the cause of the medicine's toxic effects. Now, to the FDA's credit, as soon as the exact cause of the poisoning was known, they were quick to alert S.E. Massengill Company, and Massengill did ask salespeople in pharmacies to return the product, but they didn't inform anyone that the medicine was toxic. This led to the FDA insisting that the company accurately relay the urgency of the matter in order to get the bottles off of the shelves immediately. The public was then notified of the danger through radio broadcasts and newspaper articles. With the assistance of state and local health officials, the FDA also tracked down and retrieved as much of the elixir as they could. And although they received a lot of help from officials and some physicians, Their job was made more difficult due to some physicians lying about patient deaths, Some of the elixir being sold without a prescription by druggists who had not documented patient information, and some salesmen not being upfront about information. An example about that is that one of the salesmen refused to provide any information to the FDA about the drug sale until after he was put in jail. In the end, the FDA was able to track down and retrieve 234 gallons and 1 pint out of the 240 gallons that were manufactured and sold. They determined that the remainder had been consumed. 105 people across the country died from kidney failure, most of them being children, though some sources, like Harold Watkins' obituary, which I'll touch on in a bit, claims that only 67 died. And before they died, they suffered symptoms like severe abdominal cramps, nausea and vomiting, being unable to urinate, headaches, blindness, convulsions, and coma. These symptoms lasted anywhere from 7 to 21 days before death, with, at the time, no known treatment or antidote. Although now it is known that both fomepizole and ethanol can be used, as well as hemodialysis, to treat diethylene glycol poisoning. Although even now, once kidney failure develops, if the patient survives, they will be reliant on dialysis for the rest of their life, and death, even now, from diethylene glycol poisoning is still very much a possibility. Despite knowing that diethylene glycol poisoning results in renal failure and neurotoxicity, the actual mechanism of action isn't known. What we do know is that it is absorbed quickly, both through ingestion and topically, and that the liver metabolizes it the same way that it does with alcohols, and then diethylene glycol and its metabolites are then brought to the kidneys, which is why it results in kidney failure. The minimum dose for toxicity is not known, though the current estimated lethal dose in humans is 1 milligram per kilogram. It is not known if diethylene glycol itself causes kidney failure, or if diglycolic acid or 2-hydroxyethoxyacetic acid are the cause. We know that ethanol works as a treatment, although due to its dose needing to be increased if the patient is also being treated with hemodialysis, it is not the most ideal treatment option. That would be fomepizole. But both ethanol and fomepizole are able to combat diethylene glycol poisoning by being alcohol dehydrogenase inhibitors, which prevent it from being metabolized and therefore prevent it from becoming toxic in the body. The SCE Massengill Company, however, didn't suffer because they hadn't technically broken any laws and adamantly denied having any responsibility for the deaths. Samuel Evans Massengill himself defended the drug's development and sale by saying, "My chemists and I deeply regret the fatal results, but there was no error in the manufacture of the product. We have been supplying a legitimate professional demand and not once could have foreseen the unlooked-for results. I do not feel that there was any responsibility on our part." The only charge that could be brought against the company was for misbranding, and even then only because to be called an elixir it would have to have alcohol in it, and elixir sulfanilamide had no alcohol. Technically it was a solution, not an elixir. But it was this singular charge that allowed the FDA to get involved, which meant that it allowed them to track down and retrieve the drug, because the company itself obviously wasn't going to do that without being prodded, meaning that far more people could have died if they had branded the bottle correctly, because the FDA wouldn't have been able to get involved. The company faced the maximum penalty for this, which was a fine of $26,000 for the deaths of over 100 people. To put this into perspective, that would be the equivalent of over $593,000 today. Even after this tragedy, the SCE Massengill Company continued to operate until it was bought by Beecham Pharmaceuticals in 1971. Since then, the company has gone through multiple name changes and purchases and is now owned by Prestige Brands as of 2011. Samuel Massengill died at the age of 75 in 1946, presumably from old age, and ended up only facing financial and minor reputational consequences for this mass poisoning. Harold Watkins, however, was more affected by the tragedy. After initially defending the drug's development, SCE Massengill Company fired the chemist, Harold Watkins, though his obituary later claimed that he had retired from the company. The chemist shot himself in the heart in January 1939, half a year after his departure from SCE Massengill Company. I could find no pictures of his face, only these pictures of old articles and his obituary. Now, the fact that so many children were affected with prolonged suffering before dying led to many parents writing to the president at the time, Franklin D. Roosevelt. Public outrage and the gap in regulations that this incident revealed led to legislative changes. At the time, the U.S. FDA was not authorized to check safety of new medications before they were sold. This could have been prevented if regulations were stricter, and they could have been, since as early as 1933, years before this mass poisoning, legislation was already being pushed to replace the 1906 Food and Drug Act, but it was stalled in Congress at the time of this mass poisoning. And relating to that, Walter Campbell was a lawyer who pushed hard for food and drug legislation and amendments. He contributed heavily to ethics and regulations throughout his career, and he was in his second term, I guess, as commissioner for the FDA during this mass poisoning event. He was one of the ones who had been pushing for this reform for years, and this incident further highlighted the importance of this needed change. However, this was only one of many recent tragedies he used as proof to encourage legal change, and those included many deaths and blindness resulted by dinitrophenol, liver damage and deaths caused by kinshafin, and radium poisoning, which you have probably heard about already. Following this disaster, Congress finally passed the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938 to require an FDA safety review for all new medications prior to being sold to prevent this kind of tragedy from happening again. Additionally, this granted the FDA greater authority over drug safety and required that drug labels list all ingredients. It also increased penalties for violations of these new changes. Now, one interesting tidbit about Frances Kelsey, the pharmacologist who determined that diethylene glycol was the cause of the elixir sulfanilamide poisoning, she ended up working for the FDA, and she played a key role decades later in minimizing tragedy in the United States by deeming thalidomide unsafe for sale. That might also be another incident, kind of like radium poisoning, that you might have heard of already. And honestly, a whole presentation could be just made about her alone because she was amazing. And honestly, I think is one of my new role models, going along with Jane Goodall and Steve Irwin. It is also notable that the thalidomide tragedy followed a similar pattern as this one, with proposed legislation being stuck in Congress for years until disaster struck and encouraged them to finally push the bill through. So with elixir sulfanilamide, there are many integrated factors that led to this tragedy occurring. This incident highlights how prevention is key to avoiding disaster and how checks and balances can still allow mistakes to slip through the cracks. Scientists have a duty to keep up to date on current research, especially when it comes to materials they use on a daily basis. Companies have a moral and ethical duty, or at least they should, to focus on the safety of their employees, their customers, and their products. The government has a responsibility to focus on the safety of those it governs, and regulatory agencies should have enough freedom to actively prevent disasters through regulations and to actively respond to disasters without having their hands tied by outdated laws. Now here is a slide of the references that I have. If there's any in particular that you're curious about or want to get a link to instead of just typing it out, if there's enough room in the description, I'll put them all there. Otherwise, just post a comment letting me know which resource you want to find more about or which information from a resource that you want to double check or whatever, and I'll just put that one in the comments. If there is any other similar incidents like this regarding tragedy and legislation and all of the interconnected factors therein, let me know, and I'll do some research on it and put out a video about it because this stuff is super interesting to me, and I like sharing what I find interesting. So, thank you if you've watched for this far. I appreciate it, and I will see you all later.